My father spent years telling people I was just someone who played with flight simulators. He laughed when I talked about flying. He dismissed my career, my training, and everything I had worked for because he believed he already knew the truth about me. Then, at our family barbecue, he made the biggest mistake of his life. In front of everyone, he challenged me to prove I was a real pilot. I calmly answered one question that made his Navy SEAL friend freeze in shock. The smile disappeared from my father's face. Because the call sign I gave wasn't something anyone could fake. It was something earned. And suddenly, everyone realized they had underestimated me for years. My name is Lauren Hayes, and I'm 29 years old. If you'd asked my family what I did for a living before that barbecue, most of them would have shrugged and said, something with flight simulators. That wasn't entirely their fault. It was the version my father repeated so often that everyone eventually accepted it as the truth. I've loved airplanes for as long as I can remember. While other kids dreamed about becoming movie stars or athletes, I spent weekends building model aircraft and memorizing cockpit layouts. Flying wasn't just a career I wanted. It felt like the only place where I truly belonged. My father never understood that. He respected soldiers, sailors, and Marines because he grew up around them. His closest friends were veterans, especially his old Navy SEAL teammates. To him, real service meant carrying heavy gear, sleeping in the dirt, and telling stories that sounded like action movies. Anything else seemed less important. Whenever someone asked about my career, Dad would smile politely and say, "Lauren teaches pilots on simulators. Good job, but she's not exactly flying combat missions." At first, I'd correct him. Eventually, I stopped trying. No matter how carefully I explained my work, he always found a way to simplify it until it sounded ordinary. Arguing only left both of us frustrated, so I learned to let the conversation die. Then my mom called and begged me to come to our annual family barbecue. "I know things have been tense," she said gently, "but it wouldn't feel complete without you." I agreed. I had no idea that one unexpected guest, an old Navy SEAL friend of my father's, was about to hear a simple question that would change the way my family looked at me forever. Saturday afternoon arrived with perfect weather. The backyard was already buzzing when I pulled into my parents' driveway. Kids chased each other across the lawn while burgers sizzled on the grill. My mother greeted me with a warm hug, but across the yard, my father barely looked up before returning to his conversation with several relatives. About 20 minutes later, another guest arrived. "Derek," my father shouted, breaking into the biggest smile I'd seen all day. The two men embraced like brothers. Derek was one of Dad's oldest friends, a retired Navy SEAL he admired more than almost anyone else. The entire family welcomed him, eager to hear another one of his legendary stories. Eventually, everyone gathered around the patio table, and as always, the conversation drifted toward careers. Dad proudly introduced my cousins. One was finishing medical school. Another had started his own construction company. He praised every achievement with obvious pride. Then his eyes landed on me. "And here's Lauren," he said with a grin that already warned me where this was going. "She's still teaching those flight simulators." A few relatives chuckled. I smiled politely. "Actually, I fly operational aircraft too." Dad laughed louder than anyone else. "Oh, come on. You mean the real thing?" He shook his head dramatically. "If you're such a hotshot pilot, then answer me this." The table grew quiet. "What's your call sign?" I looked at him for a second before answering calmly. "Shadow Watch." The words had barely left my mouth before I heard someone cough violently. Derek had nearly spilled his drink. He stared at me without blinking. "What did you just say?" "Shadow Watch," I repeated. The laughter disappeared. Derek slowly set his glass on the table, never taking his eyes off me. "No way," he whispered. Then he looked directly at my father. "Tom, do you have any idea who your daughter really is?" The silence around the patio felt heavier than the summer heat. Dad frowned. "Derek, what's gotten into you?" Instead of answering, Derek kept looking at me. His expression wasn't disbelief anymore. It was recognition. "Lauren," he said carefully, "mind if I ask you a couple of questions?" I nodded. "What aircraft did you first qualify on after earning your wings?" I answered without hesitation. He asked another. What matters more during a difficult mission? Perfect conditions or disciplined decision-making? Disciplined decision-making, I replied. The weather doesn't care how experienced you are. He smiled faintly. One more question followed, this one about emergency procedures and leadership under pressure. I answered the same way I always had during countless training evaluations, calmly, directly, and without trying to impress anyone. Derek leaned back in his chair. That's what I thought. Every pair of eyes shifted between us. The truth was, I had spent years training for responsibilities I couldn't casually discuss over a family barbecue. Long days, demanding evaluations, deployments away from home, and missions that required absolute professionalism had become normal parts of my life. I never talked about them because much of my work wasn't something I could casually explain, and honestly, I never felt the need to. Dad folded his arms. So you're telling me she's some kind of celebrity pilot now? No, Derek answered before I could speak. I'm telling you she's earned respect in places where respect isn't handed out. Dad forced an awkward laugh. You've got to be kidding. I'm not. The confidence in Derek's voice erased every smile around the table. For the first time in years, nobody was laughing at me. I wasn't enjoying their silence either. I hadn't come to prove anyone wrong. I'd simply answered a question honestly. Dad looked at me again, but this time there wasn't amusement in his eyes. There was uncertainty. And for the first time in my life, he seemed to realize there was an entire part of his daughter's world he had never bothered to understand. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Derek broke the silence. Tom, do you know how a call sign is earned? Dad shrugged. I figured pilots just picked something that sounded cool. Derek slowly shook his head. It doesn't work that way. He rested both hands on the table before continuing. A real call sign isn't something you give yourself. Other professionals earn the right to call you by it. It usually comes after proving your judgment, your discipline, and your ability to stay calm when everyone else is losing theirs. Every person at the table listened without saying a word. I've heard the name Shadow Watch before, Derek continued. Not because of gossip. Because people I trust spoke about it with respect. He looked at me. I never expected to meet the person behind it at a family barbecue. Dad stared at me, completely speechless. I finally decided to answer the question he had never really asked. I didn't keep quiet because I wanted to sound mysterious, I said. I kept quiet because my job isn't about collecting compliments. It's about doing my work well, respecting the people I serve with, and leaving the details where they belong. Mom reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. I wish we'd known, she whispered. You could have, I answered softly. Every time I tried to explain, the conversation ended before it really started. Dad lowered his eyes. The confidence that had filled his voice only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. I thought. He began before stopping. You thought I was pretending, I finished. He nodded slowly. I did. No anger rose inside me, only sadness, because I realized he had never truly doubted my ability. He had doubted the possibility that his quiet daughter could accomplish something extraordinary. For years, I'd accepted that misunderstanding. Today, for the first time, he was finally seeing me instead of the story he'd convinced himself was true. Nobody reached for the food anymore. The laughter, the jokes, even the music playing softly from the backyard speakers seemed to disappear into the background. Dad looked at me for a long moment before speaking. You said you tried to tell me. I did. When? The first time I completed advanced flight training. When I received my first operational assignment. When I came home after months away. Every time, you'd interrupt and tell everyone I was teaching simulators. After a while, I realized you weren't listening. You'd already decided who I was. He lowered his head. I honestly thought I knew. You knew the version that made sense to you. His shoulders sagged. I owe you an apology, Lauren. No excuses. No blaming anyone else. Just a simple apology. I spent years measuring everyone against what I understood, he admitted. If I couldn't picture it, I assumed it couldn't be that important. That wasn't fair to you. I smiled gently. I never needed you to brag about me, Dad. I just wanted you to believe me. He nodded, his eyes beginning to water. I do now. Around the table, my cousins quietly admitted they'd believed the same story because they'd heard it for years. Even my uncle shook his head and apologized for laughing earlier. Then Dad stood up. Without saying another word, he wrapped his arms around me. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment. It was awkward. It was quiet. And somehow, that made it real. For the first time since I was a little girl chasing airplanes across the backyard, I felt like my father wasn't looking at who he expected me to become. He was finally seeing the woman I had already become. A few months after that barbecue, something changed between my father and me. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't like one conversation magically erased years of misunderstanding. Trust doesn't work that way. But slowly, things became different. Dad started asking questions about my work instead of making assumptions. He wanted to understand my world instead of comparing it to his own experiences. One day, he introduced me to an old friend and said something I'll never forget. This is my daughter, Lauren. She's one of the strongest people I know. He didn't mention my title. He didn't mention my accomplishments. He didn't need to. For the first time, he was proud of the person I was, not just the things I had achieved. Looking back, I realized that day at the barbecue was never really about proving my father wrong. It was about something much deeper. For years, I thought I needed to defend myself. I thought I needed to collect achievements big enough that nobody could ignore me. But I learned something important. Your worth doesn't increase because someone finally recognizes it. And it doesn't decrease because someone refuses to see it. The people who truly understand you won't need a list of accomplishments. They won't need someone else to explain your value. They will simply believe you. That day, my father finally learned who his daughter was. But more importantly, I learned something about myself. I didn't need his approval to become the person I was meant to be. I had already earned that. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't making people admit they were wrong. It's realizing you never needed their permission to be right.